If you walked through the streets of Miami, Florida in the middle of the 1970s, you would have noticed a strange phenomenon that puzzled the locals and delighted the shopkeepers. The finest jewelry stores, the luxury car dealerships, and the high-end electronic shops were not filled with American millionaires or Arab oil sheikhs or European aristocrats. They were filled with Venezuelans. They were everywhere. They were loud, they were happy, and they were incredibly rich. They moved in packs, families of 10 or 12, navigating the malls of Florida like conquering armies. They had a nickname among the merchants of the Sunshine State. They were called the Demillos. This translates simply to, "give me two," because when a Venezuelan liked a pair of Italian shoes, he didn't buy one pair. He said, "give me two, one for me and one for my friend." When he bought a color television, which was the marvel of the age, he said, "give me two, one for the living room and one for the bathroom." They paid in cash. They carried suitcases full of US dollars that were crisp and new, smelling of the bank vaults in Caracazo. They bought condos in Brickell and mansions in Coral Gables without asking the price. They tipped waiters with $100 bills. To the average American struggling with the recession and inflation of the Carter years, these people seemed like visitors from another planet, a planet made of gold. Back in Caracas, the skyline was transforming before the eyes of the world. It was a city of construction cranes and neon lights, a concrete jungle growing faster than any other city in the hemisphere. It was the only city in South America where the Concorde, the supersonic jet that catered to the global elite, landed regularly. You could fly from Paris to Caracas, arriving in time for a champagne lunch at a French restaurant in Altamira that served lobster flown in that morning from Maine. The shops in the Sabana Grande district sold the latest fashions from Milan and Paris before they even arrived in New York or London. The whiskey consumption per capita in Venezuela was the highest in the world. They drank 18-year-old scotch like it was water. It was a party that seemed like it would never end. It was the era of Saudi Venezuela. To understand this moment of insanity, this fever dream of consumption and abundance, we have to understand the illusion. The world looked at Venezuela and saw a miracle. They saw a South American nation that had somehow cracked the code of development. It had a stable democracy where power changed hands peacefully every 5 years. It had a growing middle class that owned cars and homes, and above all, it had oil, rivers of oil, oceans of oil. But what looked like a miracle was actually a trap. It was a golden cage that was being built bar by the global financial system. And the people inside the cage were too drunk on cheap gasoline and expensive scotch to notice that the door was being locked. The story of the Saudi era begins not in Caracas, but thousands of miles away in the deserts of the Middle East. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War broke out. The Arab oil-producing nations, furious at Western support for Israel, declared an oil embargo. They turned off the tap. The price of oil did not just rise, it exploded. It quadrupled overnight. It went from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel in the blink of an eye. It was the biggest transfer of wealth in human history. Money flowed like a tidal wave from the industrial economies of the United States and Europe into the coffers of the OPEC nations. Venezuela was a founding member of OPEC. In fact, the entire idea of OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, was largely the brainchild of a Venezuelan visionary named Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso. He was a brilliant but austere man who drove a small car and read by candlelight to save electricity. He had warned his countrymen years earlier that oil was the devil's excrement. He said it brings trouble, it brings waste, it brings corruption. He predicted that the sudden influx of unearned wealth would rot the soul of the nation. But in 1974, nobody was listening to the warnings of a grumpy old man. They were listening to the sound of cash registers ringing. The president of Venezuela at this moment was a man named Carlos Andres Perez, known to everyone as Cap. He was a charismatic, energetic populist who walked fast, talked faster, and wore loud plaid jackets. He took office in 1974, just as the tsunami of petrodollars hit the Venezuelan shore. He found himself in a situation that no leader in history had ever faced. He had too much money. The treasury was overflowing. The central bank literally did not have enough vaults to store the international reserves. They had to stack sacks of dollars in the hallways of the Ministry of Finance. Carlos Andres Perez declared that Venezuela would use this money to become a first world nation within a decade. He coined the phrase La Gran Venezuela, the Great Venezuela. His plan was audacious. He wanted to nationalize the oil industry, which was still run by American companies like Exxon and Shell. He wanted to build a massive steel industry in the jungle to rival Pittsburgh. He wanted to build the largest hydroelectric dam in the world. He wanted to give a scholarship to every student who wanted to study abroad. He wanted to turn Venezuela into a modern industrial power that would lead Latin America into the 21st century. And for a few years, it seemed to work. The government launched the Gran Mariscal de Ayacucho scholarship program. Tens of thousands of young Venezuelans were sent to the best universities in the United States and Europe, completely free of charge. They were the children of mechanics and maids studying at Harvard and Oxford and the Sorbonne. It was a noble dream, a massive investment in human capital that was supposed to secure the future. But behind the dream, the economy was rotting. This is where the concept of the Dutch disease comes in. When a country gets a massive influx of foreign currency, like dollars from oil, it makes the local currency very strong. The Venezuelan bolivar was pegged to the dollar at a rate of 4.30. It was solid as a rock. You could walk into any bank in Caracas with bolivars and walk out with dollars, no questions asked. But because the bolivar was so strong, it became incredibly cheap to import things from abroad and incredibly expensive to produce things at home. Why would a Venezuelan farmer grow corn when he could buy corn from Iowa for half the price? Why would a factory in Valencia make shoes when you could import designer shoes from Italy for pennies? The productive apparatus of the country began to die. Agriculture collapsed. The fields were abandoned. The farmers moved to the cities to live in the shanty towns and live off the government handouts. Venezuela stopped making things and started buying things. They imported everything. They imported eggs. They imported clothes. They imported cars. They even imported the sand to build the concrete skyscrapers because apparently Venezuelan sand wasn't good enough. This was the first part of the trap, the addiction to imports. But the second part was far more dangerous. It was the debt. You might ask why a country that was swimming in cash needed to borrow money. This is the great paradox of the 1970s. The oil money that flooded into Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and Iran had to go somewhere. These countries could not spend it all fast enough, so they deposited it in the safest place they knew, the banks of Wall Street in London, Citibank, Chase Manhattan, Bank of America. These banks were suddenly sitting on mountains of cash deposited by the oil nations. They had a problem. A bank does not make money by holding cash. It makes money by lending cash. They needed to find someone to borrow these billions of dollars. But the U.S. economy was in a deep recession. American businesses were stagnating. They were not borrowing. So the bankers looked south. They looked at Latin America, and specifically they looked at Venezuela. They saw a country with a stable democratic government and the largest oil reserves in the Western Hemisphere. They saw the perfect borrower. Bankers in expensive suits flew from New York to Caracas on the Concorde. They stayed in the Tamanaco Hotel, drinking scotch and meeting with government ministers. They carried briefcases full of loan agreements. They didn't wait for the Venezuelan government to ask for money. They begged the Venezuelan government to take it. They sold the government a fantasy. They said, look, oil prices are going to go up forever. Today oil is $12 a barrel. Tomorrow it will be $20, then $50, then $100. If you borrow $1 billion today, the inflation and the rising oil prices will make the debt disappear. It is free money. It is leverage. The Venezuelan government, led by Carlos Andres Perez, fell for the pitch, hook, line, and sinker. They started borrowing frantically. They borrowed to pay for the massive infrastructure projects that were running over budget. They borrowed to subsidize the imports so that people could keep buying cheap whiskey and televisions. They borrowed to cover the corruption that was draining the treasury. The corruption was monumental. When there is that much money flowing through a system without checks and balances, it sticks to people's hands. Government contracts were awarded to friends of the party. Ghost companies were set up to receive loans that were never repaid. A commission was charged on every barrel of oil sold and every ton of steel bought. The era of the 12 Apostles began, referring to the 12 business tycoons who became billionaires simply by being close to the president. They built palaces in Caracas and bought islands in the Caribbean. But the most insidious part of the borrowing was the terms of the loans. The bankers were smart. They knew that the good times might not last forever, so they wrote the loan contracts with floating interest rates. This meant that the interest rate Venezuela paid was not fixed. It was tied to the U.S. prime rate or the London interbank rate. If the interest rates in the U.S. went up, the payments Venezuela had to make would go up too. Nobody in Caracas paid attention to this detail. In the mid-70s, U.S. interest rates were low. Money was cheap. The party continued. The government built the Guri Dam, one of the engineering marvels of the world, which provided electricity to the whole country. They built the Caracas Metro, a gleaming subway system that was cleaner and more modern than the New York subway. They built the sprawling industrial complex of Ciudad Guayana in the middle of the jungle. They nationalized the oil industry in 1976, creating PDVSA, the state oil company. On that day, they raised the Venezuelan flag over the oil wells and declared economic independence, but it was a hollow independence. By the end of the 70s, Venezuela had the highest per capita debt in the world. They owed billions to the very same banks that held their oil deposits. They were recycling their own money, paying interest to access their own wealth. It was a shell game of global proportions. The society began to change. The culture of hard work and thrift that had characterized the older generation of Venezuelans evaporated. It was replaced by the culture of easy money. If you needed a job, you didn't look to the private sector. You joined the government. The bureaucracy swelled to monstrous proportions. There were elevator operators for elevators that were automatic. There were gardeners for gardens that didn't exist. There were consultants who never consulted. Everyone was on the payroll. The state became the father, the mother, and the employer of the nation. And the illusion of wealth masked the deep inequality. While the middle class flew to Miami, the poor in the ranchos, the slums on the hillsides, watched the skyline rise but saw little of the benefit. They got subsidies, yes. Gasoline was cheaper than water. You could fill the tank of a massive American gas guzzler for the price of a stick of gum. Bread was artificially cheap, but their schools were crumbling and their hospitals were failing. The money was being spent on concrete and imports, not on human capital. The gap between the Venezuela of the country clubs and the Venezuela of the barrios grew wider every day. As the decade of the 70s came to a close, the warning signs were flashing red. The oil market was becoming saturated. New oil fields in the North Sea and Alaska were coming online, breaking the OPEC monopoly. The demand for oil was dropping as Western countries became more energy efficient. The price of oil stopped rising. It began to wobble. In 1979, a new president, Luis Herrera Campins, took office. In his inaugural address, he looked at the finances of the nation and uttered a phrase that should have terrified everyone. He said, "I'm inheriting a mortgaged country." He saw the books. He saw the debt. He saw that the spending was unsustainable. He saw that for every dollar that came in, $2 were going out. But he could not stop the machine. The momentum of the spending was too great. The political cost of austerity was too high. The people were addicted to the subsidies. The Dame-Dos mentality was ingrained in the national psyche. People believed that being rich was their natural state. So instead of cutting back, the government doubled down. They borrowed more money to pay the interest on the old loans. They played a game of musical chairs, hoping the music would never stop. But the music was about to stop. In Washington, D.C., a man named Paul Volcker was appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve. He was a giant of a man with a cigar and a mission. His mission was to kill inflation in the United States. To do that, he was about to do something that would destroy the Venezuelan dream. He was about to raise interest rates to levels never seen before. As we end the first part of this story, Venezuela is standing at the precipice. It is 1979. The nightclubs in Caracas are full. The highways are jammed with American cars. The government is spending money as if there is no tomorrow. The banks in New York are counting their profits, but the trap has been set. The floating interest rates are a ticking time bomb. The oil price is softening, and the country that thinks it is richer than the USA is about to find out that it is actually a debtor living on borrowed time. In the second part of this story, we will see the crash. We will see the day the money ran out. We will see the infamous Black Friday and the social explosion that followed, proving that the Saudi era was nothing but a shimmering mirage in the desert. The year is 1981, and the trap is about to snap shut. In the United States, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, makes a decision that will shake the foundations of the global economy. To fight the runaway inflation of the dollar, which was eating away at the American economy, he raises interest rates to 20%. It is a shock therapy for the American economy. Painful, but necessary. But for Venezuela, it is a death sentence. Remember the fine print in those loan contracts, the floating interest rates? Overnight, the interest payments on Venezuela's massive foreign debt doubled and then tripled. The country had borrowed billions when money cost 5%. Now they had to service that debt at 20%. At the exact same time, the oil market collapsed. The glut of oil in the world drove prices down. The perfect storm had arrived. Expenses were skyrocketing while income was plummeting. The vice was tightening. For a few years, the government tried to hide the reality. They burned through their reserves trying to prop up the currency. They kept the believe-our pegged at 430 to the dollar. They wanted to maintain the illusion of the Saudi Venezuela. They wanted the middle class to keep flying to Miami. They wanted the scotch to keep flowing. But you cannot fight mathematics. The central bank was bleeding dollars. Every day, millions of dollars left the country as nervous investors and wealthy Venezuelans moved their money to accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. It was capital flight on an industrial scale. The people who had benefited most from the boom, the so-called apostles of development, were the first to abandon the ship, taking their billions with them. Then came the day of reckoning. Friday, February 18th, 1983. It is a date etched into the memory of every Venezuelan. It is known simply as Veris Negro Black Friday. On that morning, the government finally admitted defeat. They announced that they could no longer defend the value of the currency. The believer was devalued. The exchange rate of 430, which had been the symbol of Venezuelan stability for decades, vanished instantly. The government established a complex system of multiple exchange rates, but the reality was brutal. The currency crashed. Imagine waking up and finding that your savings have lost half their value overnight. Imagine being a business owner who owes money in dollars and suddenly your debt has tripled. Imagine being a student in London on a government scholarship and suddenly the check doesn't arrive. Your credit card stops working and you're evicted from your apartment. The psychological shock was immense. The era of Damados ended that morning. The flights of the Concorde were canceled. The shopping sprees in Miami stopped. The Venezuelan middle class, which had felt rich and invincible, suddenly felt poor and vulnerable. The party was over, and the lights had been turned on, revealing a messy room full of broken glass and unpaid bills. The hangover had begun, but the financial crash was just the beginning of the agony. The 1980s became known in Latin America as the lost decade. For Venezuela, it was a slow, painful slide into poverty. The government was bankrupt. They could no longer borrow from the international banks because the banks knew they couldn't pay. In fact, the banks were now the enemy. This is where the twist of the banking system comes into play. The same American banks that had practically forced loans onto Venezuela in the 70s were now demanding their money back with aggressive ruthlessness. They sent teams of lawyers and accountants to Caracazo. They demanded that the government cut social spending. They demanded that subsidies be removed. They demanded that the state assets be sold. They did not care that the Venezuelan people were suffering. They only cared about the solvency of their balance sheets. The smiling bankers with the briefcases were replaced by grim auditors with calculators. The Venezuelan government tried to negotiate. They refinanced the debt again and again. But every refinancing came with conditions. And every condition meant more pain for the average citizen. The infrastructure that had been built during the boom began to rot. The roads developed potholes that swallowed cars. The hospitals ran out of medicine and the equipment broke down. The schools fell into disrepair. The great Venezuela was crumbling before people's eyes. By 1988, the situation was desperate. The man who had presided over the boom, Carlos Andres Perez, decided to run for president again. He campaigned on nostalgia. He reminded people of the good times. He promised to bring back the abundance. He danced on stages and waved his arms. The people, desperate for hope, believed him. They voted him back into office in a landslide. They thought that simply by having him in the palace, the oil prices would rise and the dollars would return. They thought he had a magic wand. But when Kep took office in 1989, he found the cupboard was bare. There was no money. The international reserves were effectively zero. He had no choice. He had to turn to the lender of last resort, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The IMF offered Venezuela a bailout package, a loan of $4.5 billion to stabilize the economy. But the IMF is not a charity. They demanded a strict structural adjustment program. It was called LR Vayashi, the Great Turn. The package required the government to lift price controls on goods. It required the privatization of state companies. And most explosively, it required the removal of the subsidy on gasoline. For Venezuelans, cheap gasoline was a birthright. It was the one tangible benefit they got from being an oil-rich nation. Raising the price of gas was a taboo. It was the third rail of Venezuelan politics. But Carlos Andres Perez, trapped by the debt and the bankers, agreed to the terms. He announced the package on television, telling the people that the sacrifices were necessary for the future. On February 27th in 1989, the new prices went into effect. The price of gasoline rose, and with it, the price of public transportation. The bus drivers raised their fares. The people living in the commuter towns around Caracas woke up to go to work and found they couldn't afford the bus ride. It started as a small protest in the town of Gorinas. People began to shout. They began to burn tires. And then, like a spark falling into a pool of gasoline, the anger exploded. The protest spread to Caracas. People descended from the ranchos into the city center. But this was not a political march. It was a riot. It is known as the Caracazo. For 3 days, the city of Caracazo burned. People looted supermarkets. They looted electronic stores. They looted shopping malls. They were taking back what they felt had been stolen from them. They were looting the symbols of the Saudi era that they could no longer afford. They carried sides of beef and television sets on their backs. It was the rage of a population that had been promised paradise and given purgatory. The government panicked. The police were overwhelmed. Carlos Andres Perez, the man who had been the hero of the people, suspended constitutional rights. He sent the army into the streets. He gave the order to shoot. The repression was brutal. Soldiers with automatic weapons fired into the crowds. They fired into the shanty towns. They fired indiscriminately. The official death toll was around 300, but human rights organizations estimate that thousands may have died. Bodies were buried in mass graves. The Caracazo broke the bond between the people and the democratic system. It destroyed the legitimacy of the traditional political parties. It destroyed the myth of Venezuelan exceptionalism. The illusion of the 70s had led directly to the massacre of the 80s. The wealth had been a trap. By borrowing against the future, Venezuela had mortgaged its stability. The U.S. banking system had profited on the way up, collecting massive fees for arranging the loans and holding the deposits. And they profited on the way down, getting bailed out by the IMF packages that squeezed the Venezuelan people to pay the interest. The psychological scar of this era cannot be overstated. It created a deep resentment against the United States and against capitalism. The people felt tricked. They felt that the wealth of their nation had been looted by a conspiracy of foreign bankers and corrupt local elites. They looked at the rusting skeletons of unfinished construction projects and saw monuments to theft. They looked at the politicians and saw liars. It was in this environment of ruin and anger that a young military officer named Hugo Chavez saw his opening. 3 years after the Caracazo, in 1992, he launched a coup attempt. He failed militarily, but he succeeded politically. He told the people that the system was rotten. He told them that the oil wealth belonged to them. He tapped into the nostalgia for the lost wealth and the anger at the betrayal. When he spoke, he wasn't just speaking about politics. He was speaking about the broken promise of the Saudi era. The Saudi era proved that money is not wealth. Wealth is productivity. Wealth is education. Wealth is institutions. Venezuela had money, but it didn't have the institutions to manage it. It suffered from the resource curse in its most acute form. The oil made the state autonomous from society. The government didn't need taxes from the people, so it didn't need to listen to the people. It only needed to please the international oil markets and the international bankers. When the oil markets turned and the bankers turned, the state collapsed. The tragedy of the Dame Dose generation is that they thought they were investing in a modern country, but they were just spending their inheritance on a party. They woke up with a hangover that has lasted for 40 years. Today, if you visit Caracazo, you can still see the remnants of that era. You can see the futuristic architecture of the 70s, now stained and crumbling. You can see the skeletons of buildings that were never finished, standing like tombstones. And in the minds of the older generation, you can still find the memory of the time when the Concorde landed at Meta Airport, and the Venezuelan boulevard was the envy of the world. But it is a bitter memory, because they know now that the wealth was not real. It was a loan taken out against their children's future. And the payments on that loan are still being made today in the form of poverty, migration, and the destruction of a nation that once dreamed of being the great Venezuela. The banks got their money back, the politicians got their kickbacks, but the people got the bill, and the bill was everything they had. The story of Saudi Venezuela is the story of Icarus flying too close to the sun on wings made of oil and borrowed dollars, only to fall crashing into the sea. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.